Good afternoon, and welcome to the Water Research Foundation webcast for project number 4662, Challenges and Practical Approaches to Water Reuse Pricing. My name is Jonathan Cuppett. I'm a research manager with the Water Research Foundation, and I will be your moderator for today's webcast. And today we are going to be talking about pricing reuse water, and primarily as that relates to non-potable reuse. And as many of you know, there are a variety of challenges on this topic as well as some opportunities. And the discussion today is really going to focus on the results as well as the recommendations of this recently completed research report. So hopefully most of you have heard by now that the Water Research Foundation and the Water and Environment and Reuse Foundation have integrated. That process formally started at the beginning of 2018, and the reason that I'm really reminding everyone of this is because today I think is a great example of what an integrated research organization can provide. Not only will we talk today about this specific reuse pricing project, but Stephanie, who you will hear from in a few minutes, we'll also discuss our comprehensive reuse-related research portfolio. So we are excited to continue to provide results from a one water-related research approach for our membership. So again, the key driver for today's webcast is really the completion of a recently published project related to water reuse pricing. And the report for this project is available to members on the waterrf.org website. And the best way to access that is just going to be to go to the home page, and in the search bar, if you can just type in 4662, that will take you to the project page, which will look exactly like this. And you can see there on the bottom right-hand side, there is a place to download the report as well as the executive summary. And now I'm going to introduce the two presenters that will be speaking today. Our first speaker will be Stephanie McGregor. Stephanie is a senior research manager at the Water Research Foundation. She primarily focuses on water reuse, and she will be providing a brief overview of the reuse research portfolio at the Water Research Foundation. Our second speaker will be Bob Rauscher. Bob is the Director of Water Economics and Planning at Corona Environmental Consulting. Bob has 40 years of experience specializing in economics, risk management, and strategic planning for the water sector. He is a noted expert on affordability, benefit cost, and triple bottom line analysis. And Bob also provides expert support on sustainability, water reuse, climate change, adaptive management, and integrated water resource management. Bob earned a PhD in natural resource economics and public finance from the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And Bob will be discussing ultimately the approach, results, and recommendations from the research project. So before I turn this over to our first presenter, I just want to remind viewers that following the presentation, there is going to be a Q&A session, and viewers are encouraged to enter questions at any time directly through the webcast page during the presentation. Also, there is currently the slide deck that we will be presenting today. That is available for download right now on the left of your screen. If you go under Event Resources, you can download that there. And also an archived version of today's webcast will be available on our website under the project page for 4662 within the next few days. So with that, I will hand it over to our first presenter, Stephanie McGregor.
Thanks, Jonathan. So as Jonathan said, with the integration of the foundations, we've developed a much larger portfolio of reuse research covering a wide variety of end uses. So today I'm just going to provide you a really brief overview of some of the types of research we have available and the resources, as well as how to find them, because on our website it can be a little bit overwhelming to try to access what you need. So to begin with, our non-potable research includes work on irrigation and industrial reuse, as well as a large number of projects on agricultural reuse. This is a topic that's become very popular over the last couple of years, and so it's become more of a research focus. Our potable reuse work breaks down into several topic areas, including the removal of pathogens and chemicals, the optimization and monitoring of treatment train performance, and all other aspects of advanced water treatment that ensure safe water suited for its intended end use. We currently have about 30 active projects, including 15 that are funded through a grant with the California State Water Resources Control Board. I manage about a third of those projects, so there's lots of support if you're looking for this type of work. I'd like to just mention a few of our synthesis documents that you may find useful. These are great reference documents if you want findings that are compiled from multiple reports and sources. We currently have one available for potable, one for agricultural, and one for industrial reuse. You can find these on our website with the reference numbers that are given in the parentheses here. Getting more toward the topic for today's discussion, I just wanted to introduce a project that's related that was done as part of the Legacy WENRF. And as water scarcity increases, we need to move closer to direct potable reuse in order to meet basic needs. However, as we move up that scale, there's an increasing cost associated with the need to import or reuse our water supplies. So that was kind of the driver for this research project, which was published in 2018 by our team at Hazen and Sawyer and the University of New South Wales. It was partially funded by USBR and includes an Excel-based tool the utilities can use to evaluate water supply options. This tool includes social and environmental criteria, as well as traditional economic metrics like the cost of import and the amount of water produced. It includes a multi-criteria decision analysis where there are criteria that can be weighted differently based on site-specific conditions. And it allows for different water supply options to be evaluated along with different treatment options for potable reuse. So this is just a conceptual overview of the tool, which is called WaterSet. It begins with a list of up to 3 water supply options to be evaluated. The user would input cost estimates and other site-specific information like unit processes, facility size, chemical requirements, and energy use. And then the model calculates estimates of capital, operations, and maintenance costs. The tool then takes user input and incorporates a data table to calculate values for economic criteria like employment and environmental criteria like generation of pollutants. So then the third arm of this tool is the social criteria, which are calculated separately using the social impact analysis model. So this captures values that could be important to a particular utility, like the level of public acceptance or the potential for increased recreational opportunities. So these are things that might not apply to everyone, but it's great to have the option to incorporate them into your analysis. So all 3 of these arms of criteria are then combined into the multi-criteria decision analysis, which calculates a total score for each water supply option and provides a ranking based on the total score. There's multiple options for how you can view the output of the tool, different types of charts and images, which can be really useful if you're trying to demonstrate the concept. But maybe the bigger question is, where can you find all of this? So what I'm showing here is the website werf.org. And so if you click up here at the top on the research areas section, and then down on water reuse, that'll take you to our main page, which has all of our latest news, links to products and tools, and research at a glance, which is also given in this top link on my list. This lists all of our projects, all of our reports, and gives executive summaries for those projects. If you're interested in webcasts like this, we, in addition to putting on our own webcast series, we partner with the Water Reuse Association. So I would encourage you to check out their program as well for those partnership webcasts. The final thing I'd like to introduce you to is where the red arrow just popped up under Popular Tools on our homepage. And there you can access Reuse 101, which is a library of videos, animations, and other plain language materials that are a great resource for presentations, meetings, visitor centers, all of that kind of thing. I've included a link here that you can use to visit it directly. Another component of Reuse 101 is the Global Connections Map. This allows you to zoom in on different areas of the world, shown here, that are doing reuse. So when you click on one of these water drops, it'll take you to a specific site, and it provides a brief introduction to the type of reuse and shows videos on the process and the story of that location. It might include interviews with staff at that location or the general public, and it's been a really popular resource for people to introduce the concept of reuse and how it's taking place in different locations. So I would really encourage you to use this and our other reuse tools and reports, and feel free to contact us if you have any questions. So that's my brief high-level overview, and with that I will turn it over to Bob.
Okay, well, thank you, Stephanie, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to be running through a presentation here on this project that we recently completed for the Foundation on challenges and successful strategies for pricing reuse water. And before I delve into the slides, I think one of the interesting things that evolved through the course of this project is that you might think of reuse pricing as a fairly narrow topic, but what we learned as we went through is that this really broadens out into a more comprehensive suite of issues about regional planning and governance across the water sector as a whole. Hopefully we'll convey that here as we work our way through the slides. So first, this is the project 4662. It was recently published within the last 2 or 3 months, I believe. So you can find it on the website from the Foundation. Jonathan Cuppett, our host today, was our research manager, and we had a really good project advisory committee with Todd Cristiano, Richard Liu, and Sean Korn. For the research team, there was myself, as well as my colleague Jim Henderson at Corona Environmental, 2 really good senior experts and practitioners in water reuse, Rich Atwater, who many of you might be familiar with for all his work in Southern California at Inland Empire and West Basin, and now at Met, and Eric Rosenblum, who's done a lot of good work in this sector as well. We also had some Australian input from the Institute of Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology, Sydney. So Joanne Chung and Rachel Watson provided some really interesting perspectives from down under. And Apt Associates administered the contract. We had a lot of good participating utilities, so I really want to express my appreciation to all of them. I won't read them off here. I'll give you a moment to kind of glance over the list. Excuse me. You'll see that there are several that have an asterisk next to them. Those that have the asterisks were served as case studies. We had 10 case studies in all. They're all part of the report. And interesting to see the issues in common and the unique features as well across the different utilities. So for my presentation today, I'm going to provide an overview of reuse pricing strategies and move on from there to providing a basis for the beneficiary pays approach to looking at reuse pricing and cost recovery. We'll also talk a bit about contracts as convenient mechanisms for achieving your objectives as a reuse organization, and move on to some of the broader issues about the institutional arrangements that can lead to a virtual one water utility. So speaking of one water, we all are striving towards a one water approach in true integrated water resource management. And there's broad recognition that reuse is the nexus, the kind of connecting tissue between the wastewater utilities and the water supply utilities. However, as a practical matter, we find that utilities typically are siloed from one another. And another thing that really emerged from our project work was seeing how change happens, and regional needs and values for reuse change over time, and that has implications for where reuse programs need to go. So the challenge is, how do you meet the evolving values and needs related to reuse within a given region, because change does happen and needs and values do change over time. And how do you meet those changing needs, given that the reuse program is usually set up to address whatever problem is confronting the community or the region initially. But like all of us, reuse programs grow up and mature, and some of us mature, and as they do so, the needs and values change as well. So this is really kind of tracing the lifetime of a reuse program. From our work, we have three major themes, and I'll go through them and discuss them one by one. So the first one is more narrowly related to reuse pricing itself. And what really emerges is that setting the rates for reuse or setting the prices is only one of several tools available for establishing markets for reuse, incentivizing reuse, and here we're focusing mostly on non-potable reuse, and working towards cost recovery. And a corollary to that is that contracts and related agreements play integral roles in the price setting and cost recovery. So let's step back for a minute and think about, if you have a new reuse program, it's in its infancy, what are some of the issues that you're facing and the challenges related to pricing? Well, first of all, you're going to need to try to recover your costs. What are your revenue requirements that will cover your costs? And your reuse programs tend to be relatively expensive, at least compared to what water supply planners and customers in most regions are used to seeing. So, it's a relative cost for this new water supply is somewhat high. At the same time, if you're providing non-potable reuse, you have to create a market. You have to find customers, someone to take this water. And when you're doing so, you're competing against the potable supply or self-supply. You may have irrigators or others who have well water or other sources. And these are sources that are readily available. The customers already are hooked up. They're familiar with them. They're reasonably priced. In addition to having to compete against them, you're facing customers who have retrofit costs and uncertainties about what it really will mean for them to be hooked up to and receiving reclaimed water, and all the doubts and resistance that may go along with that. And as a result, we end up with a price point for reuse that is often below cost. So, in other words, you're selling at a discount. You're not going to fully cover your costs at the price that you need in order to create your market. So just a brief diversion here. We're thinking about pricing and the values that people associate with water. I thought this was a pretty telling photo. If we think of reuse programs being expensive, we may be thinking of maybe $2,000 or so per acre foot. If we're looking at this bottle of smart water at $3, and if we assume that's a quart, and that may be a generous assumption, that boils down to about $4 million per acre foot. And for those of you who are not in the Western U.S., you might think of that instead as $12,000 or more per 1,000 gallons. So reuse really is a bargain in many ways. So when utilities are facing the task of setting their prices for reuse water in the early stages of developing their program, they have these tasks. They have to set the prices, and they have to develop and maintain a market of committed long-term customers. And they need to establish and maintain contracts with those customers for providing that water to their current and future customers, while at the same time aiming to recover all or sufficient portion of their total costs over a suitable planning horizon. So here again, it's you're trying to do cost recovery through how you set prices, but at the same time you have to create a market. And one of the things that emerged is what I've highlighted here in red, that when you're aiming to recover all or sufficient portion of your costs, you don't necessarily need to try to recover all the costs at once, particularly as you're starting up a new program. So there's the notion of sufficient portion. Well, what does that mean? And doing so over a suitable planning horizon. You're setting up a reuse program. You have a decade, 2 decades or so to let that program mature and bring customers on, and to have strategies to help recover your costs over a period of time. There's several challenges in reuse pricing. There's the issue of cost recovery versus market creation. That's what we have been speaking to in the previous slides. You're also competing with potable and self-supply, and you have multiple different kinds of applications and customer types who have their own kind of needs and expectations and worries. One of the challenges is figuring out what the real cost of your reuse water is. If you're taking wastewater effluent, where does the cost of wastewater treatment end and the cost of creating a reuse supply begin? And there are all the institutional and jurisdictional challenges of having multiple agencies involved, which may have different service areas, typically have different management and governing boards, and so forth. So another critical thing in all of this is thinking back to cost of service. And cost of service is the foundation of all pricing in the water sector. And there are good reasons for this. It ensures that users pay their fair share of the costs. It protects the customers from price gouging by water suppliers who are natural monopolies. And it provides utilities with the revenues they need to provide and sustain this essential service. In other words, cost of service should lead you to full cost recovery. And its cost of service is central to how public utility commissions oversee rates for investor-owned utilities, and also in many municipal and state jurisdictions, how public agencies are viewed and governed. So there are several challenges with cost of service, even for a potable supply or an existing wastewater program. You have to allocate costs across different service lines and customer classes, and that can be a bit arbitrary. Affordability is a huge challenge, and there's often political reluctance to raise rates, even though you're facing a lot of essential utility needs, such as infrastructure renewal and so forth. Let's see, so cost of service pricing, there are additional challenges added for reuse. What does reuse really cost? Do we need to pay for wastewater effluent? And what's a suitable price if you do? How do you deal with the retrofit costs that potential customers are facing? And how do you meet the water quality needs of different multiple types of customers? And then there are the institutional challenges. How do you think of cost of service when you're you're spanning multiple water agencies in service areas that may not fully coincide. There's the accounting for avoided costs. And this is a really key issue. It's certainly one that gets my attention as an economist. When we think of the benefits of an action, a lot of the times, particularly in the water sector, we do things because we're avoiding something that's more costly. We're investing in reclaimed water because that is cost-effective or provides cost savings compared to either having water shortages or finding an alternative new potable supply. But those avoided costs don't show up on any accounting ledger, and so they can get lost when the financial analysts are looking at things. And we need to recognize the role of beneficiary pays, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. So some of the solutions come back to aligning who benefits with who pays, the beneficiary pays principle, where we're trying to weave the value of the reuse program into how it's priced. And this is the same thing that we expect the market to do for other commodities that are traded. That, pricing reflects the value to the users. We want to transition over time to fiscally sustainable rates. As a young reuse program, you may need to subsidize your costs to your customers to get them on board and create that market, but you can use contract terms to escalate those rates over time. And that's a strategy that some of the more mature programs have used very successfully. And all that's done using contracts as the mechanism to meet these needs and attain these goals. Aligning who pays with who benefits. Reuse customers are rarely the only beneficiaries of a reuse program. Potable supply customers typically benefit from non-potable reuse because it leaves a more reliable potable supply. You're reducing the demands on the potable system by diverting some non-potable uses to reclaim water. You're typically or often avoiding the cost of having to otherwise expand your potable system, either enhancing treatment or expanding its capacity by bringing in another new source. And the same thing can happen on the wastewater side of the ledger. You can avoid costs for having to upgrade wastewater discharge facilities, and there is a possibility of securing some revenues by supplying reuse source waters. And there can also be benefits external to the service area and the utilities. You may leave more water in stream for downstream communities, and there could be environmental benefits with wetland enhancement and stream flow enhancements and so forth. And one of the things that's encouraging is that in recent years, public utility commissions and some court rulings recognize this challenge of having to find fiscal resources from folks who don't necessarily receive and use reclaimed water. For example, the California Public Utility Commission has a ruling from 2014 basically setting up a policy that recognizing that you probably need to price your reclaimed water below potable, which means that you're not going to fully recover your costs by the rates you charge your reuse customers. And they endorsed the use of cross subsidies from potable customers to help cover reuse costs, where that can be justified. And they require a benefit cost analysis of reuse projects to help them align the beneficiaries with who pays. There's also been court rulings under Prop 218 in California. If you're not familiar with this, Proposition 218 requires that municipal or publicly owned utilities have to adhere strictly to cost of service pricing. But here again, cases brought before the court found that cross subsidies from potable customers can pay for reuse expenses, where that's appropriate, where potable customers are indeed some of the beneficiaries from having reuse in the community supply portfolio. I want to take a moment to differentiate financial analysis from economic analysis. And this gets at, in many ways, the issue of avoided costs, which don't show up on the ledger. So financial analysis is a pretty black and white exercise where you're comparing what your revenues are to your costs. And, the costs are, pretty well documented. You have your treatment costs, and you have storage and distribution costs, and on-site retrofit costs. The size of the boxes, are just arbitrary, but you have costs and you have revenues, and typically when you set up a reuse program, your revenues are unlikely to fully cover your costs. You're operating at a loss from the accountant's standpoint. Now, when you think about this from an economist's perspective, suddenly you're like Dorothy landing in the Wizard of Oz. Now it becomes a more colorful world. And you can start thinking about, instead of costs and revenues, you're thinking about costs and benefits, or costs and where we get value. And the kind of a triple bottom line perspective is useful for this. So again, we have costs and we have different components of costs. And if you think about what the benefits are, they can be different things in different settings, but they can be any of all these things that we'll run through here. The avoided or deferred costs for either the water supply or wastewater entity. Having a reuse program increases your local control because everything is happening locally, as opposed to many situations where you need to rely on outside entities, maybe a source that's a surface source or groundwater source that is regulated in terms of what you can draw, or imported water that may be subject to different disruptions. And you have more water supply reliability because your source water for a reclaim program is indoor water use, which ends up in the wastewater effluent, and that varies. There's limited variability of that across seasons and across dry and wet years. And you also may have environmental benefits. So the point of all this is that when you look at this from a triple bottom line perspective, there are many different types of benefits that can arise out of a reuse program, and you need to consider all of them to justify whether the benefits as a whole outweigh the costs, and to think about, given the benefits that come up, who receives them, and how can we capture some of that to cover the costs. And just one example, if you're doing a triple bottom line analysis, you may look at how things stack up with a reuse program. Here's an example of some work we did some time ago for the Chino Basin outside of LA, east of LA. And they undertook a very large reuse program with many dimensions to it, and also included some groundwater desalting. And they had to invest over $1 billion in capital outlays to make this whole program go on a regional basis. But they ended up saving, their avoided costs were nearly $2 billion, $1.9 billion if you look in the lower right corner. And there were also some social and environmental benefits that went with that as well. So even though it was a very costly investment, when you considered avoided costs and social and environmental costs, benefits as well, the benefits greatly outweighed the expense. Briefly, you can use contracts as a way of fulfilling your objectives. You can use long-term contracts to ensure the revenue stream for an expensive new reuse program. Long-term contracts provide a lot of security for both the utility and the customers, particularly when you're starting up and you need some guarantee of a revenue stream over the initial years, and your customers new to a reuse program, need some assurance of what they're going to be buying into. But you can also use contracts to transition to higher rates as the program matures, particularly building that in at the outset. A way of also including some assistance to cover retrofit costs. And one of the utilities we worked with had a 5-year loan repayment program built into the initial rates for new customers. Take or pay contracts can be useful to ensure your customers actually take the reclaimed water that they've signed up for and pay you regardless. So there's a revenue security. And when you're in the early stages and incentivizing use of your reclaimed water, high fixed charges and low volumetric rates provide that revenue stability. Now, as the program matures and maybe now you have sufficient demand, you may want to switch that around so that you're incentivizing more efficient use with higher volumetric rates. But that's part of what happens as a program matures. So we have 3 major themes. We just wrapped up the first one. The second major theme is having clearly articulated objectives for reuse is important for pricing and associated cost recovery strategies. And governance and pricing strategies need to be adaptable as regional needs and objectives evolve over time. So here we're starting to move to the transition from a new program to one that's beginning to mature. So I'll briefly touch on some of the insights we got from our case studies. I won't go through the case studies individually, but just hit some high points that we observed that tended to be in common across the different utilities. One is the importance of aligning your institutional mission with your reuse objectives, and that these objectives for your reuse program tend to evolve over time. In a lot of the more mature programs, we saw that they started up as a way of dealing with a wastewater discharge issue. New, very stringent requirements on discharge that were going to cause a significant technical and or fiscal problem for the utility. Turning to a reuse program was a way of cost-effective way of addressing that problem. And then what we've also seen is that as communities grow and there's more growth in outlying areas, the initial reuse program may have been close to the wastewater plant, which typically is adjacent to a coast or a major waterway. And as the community expands outward, they find that sewer line capacity from those outlying areas gets to be strained, and reuse becomes again a viable strategy. You can set up scalping plants in some of these more outlying areas and take pressure off the sewer line capacity and create a water supply resource for these new growing communities in the outlying areas. And then eventually in most of these communities, the program, the needs of the communities evolved so that water supply was now the most critical issue, and that was really the main motivation for having and expanding their reuse programs. And so, as these objectives and the values for reuse change, that changes some of the nature of pricing and planning. And you need to keep your institutional arrangements aligned with how those changes happen, and that's a challenge, because you typically have silos across these entities. And if you have a wastewater entity or group of wastewater entities in a region that have been merged or cooperating together and have set up a reuse program as part of their addressing a wastewater management challenge, are they prepared or in a position to deal with what needs to get done as needs change and water supply becomes primary issue in the region. And so ultimately, for integrated water resources management, we need kind of integrated pricing and cost allocations and agreements amongst all the different entities about how to manage this resource. Some additional case studies of interest came from our 2 Australian participants. We had Southeast Water from Australia outside the Melbourne area, and Yarra Valley Water also from the Melbourne, Greater Melbourne area. And their experience is very similar to the U.S., even though Australia has a very different institutional setup for its water agencies. For example, in Australia, the utilities are state-owned as both wholesale and retail entities. But even though they're publicly owned, they are subject to economic regulation, with the expectation that they'll use full cost of service measures and earn the state an acceptable return on investment. So they're regulated economically as if they were an investor-owned system in the U.S., but they are state-owned. And even with these institutional arrangements, they still were applying discount pricing and cross subsidies for their reuse programs, particularly to get them started. And we also saw a similar evolution of reuse objectives, that they often started with wastewater discharge as the motivation for startup of a reuse program, and then expanding the reuse program when sewer capacity became strained as more outlying areas of the community grew, and then ultimately the recognition that how they really needed and valued the reuse program was as an instrumental part of their water supply portfolio. And similar challenges and successes as we've seen in the U.S. For example, they also have to deal with how to manage seasonal demands. They have often relied on significant changes between peak and off-peak pricing, seasonal, and using that to motivate users to create on-site storage to reduce peak demands. And they've also seen greater acceptance of non-potable reuse in new developments, becoming part of what's accepted and even sought after as a way of keeping communities green. And then our third major theme is that reuse pricing is part of the broad governance landscape. As we move towards more integrated water planning and management, we need to think about how reuse programs and institutional setups and pricing fit within that landscape. So out of all this, we have a few points of guidance that I'll run through before wrapping up. First is that pricing is only part of the picture. Contracts, institutional arrangements, and evolution of programs and pricing and institutional arrangements over time. Reuse programs tend to go through various cycles just like we do. They're starting off, they need different types of support and systems than when they mature along with the rest of their communities. It's important to keep an eye on what your objectives are for the program and how those objectives might change or evolve as programs mature. Maturing programs create opportunities, but they also face challenges. The institutional arrangements can have a large impact on a reuse program, both across time as programs mature and across space as programs become more regional and as communities grow. Cost of service is very important, but it's of limited application for the initial pricing for reuse programs. And the beneficiary pays approach is gaining traction. It certainly helps align cost recovery with your reuse program objectives. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Jonathan for questions.
Okay, well, thanks, Bob, for the informational presentation. And, as Bob mentioned, he touched on a few case studies there. And so there's more information and more details, obviously, that we can go into on the presentation available in the report, and that report's available. And so, yeah, if you have any questions or if anything came up during the presentation, go ahead and enter those questions through your interface there. And we'll kind of go ahead and get started with a few questions. So, Bob, you talked a lot about, I guess, this non-potable reuse pricing, and any thoughts about how, I guess, emergence of potable reuse plays into how we think about our pricing for reuse water?
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, it's an interesting issue because with the emergence of potable reuse, both indirect and direct, becoming a much more viable option for communities to consider, it changes the playing field quite a bit. If you're starting a new program or you're going to be expanding your reuse program, the new or expanded program moving into potable reuse, those costs can be recovered through your potable customers, and basically that expense gets folded into all the other cost of service considerations for your potable customers. So that can be relatively straightforward. I think where it gets more complicated is if you have an established non-potable program and you're reaching a point where you're thinking of transitioning some or all of that to potable reuse. Now you have a much more complicated situation where you have set up markets and you have businesses and homeowners associations and so forth, all kind of now accustomed to and relying on their non-potable supply. So there's I think some real serious thinking that needs to go on about how you deal with the fact that you may have set up a non-potable program and now would like to transition a part of that over to a potable approach, and how do you serve those customers now that you've got them on board?
Okay, thanks. So the next question, I guess, is two questions, and both have to deal with the relationship ultimately with the wastewater utility. So I guess the one question is it appropriate for a reuse provider to pay for wastewater effluent, and how do you consider a price? And then another question on the same topic, but I guess going the other direction was, what about receiving a subsidy from the wastewater treatment plant for some of their benefits and or avoided costs? So I guess, again, first part of it was, can a reuse provider pay for wastewater effluent, and how do you figure out a price? And then any thoughts on the alternative where you're getting a subsidy from the wastewater?
Yeah, and that's a great pairing of questions, and there can be justification for going either way on that. I think in terms of being charged, if you're a reuse entity, you're trying to set up a program and the wastewater supplier wants to charge you, the two sides of that coin are, on the one hand, you're taking something that's a waste and a liability and you're turning it into a resource. So you're doing them a favor. So maybe you should expect a subsidy from them. At the same time, part of what I've heard from some practitioners are that, wastewater agencies, they recognize now they have a resource. They believe they've got an obligation to their ratepayers to make the best use of it, and if it has value, they should be able to sell it for some reasonable price. and even cases where a reuse provider would like to get more supply water, but the wastewater entity wants to hold it because it thinks it might have a higher value juice and more revenue potential in a market that might emerge later on. So it's a complex situation. Yeah, it's I guess part of the irony is, where the wastewater comes from and where the reuse water would go to is typically, it's the same customer base. So ultimately, it comes out of the same pockets, the same households, and it's really a matter of, does the wastewater agency want to find a way to keep its bills more manageable, and push that cost more onto the potable and reuse customers, or vice versa? And this is really why it boils down to needing to try to overcome the silos and recognize that you're serving the broader community, and ultimately it's the same folks, the same households, the same businesses that will pay. It's just a matter of which bills go up faster. So that's kind of a long-winded answer, but it kind of points to the need to recognize who ultimately pays, and the need for good cooperation and kind of institutional alignment.
Okay, thanks. So another question, and this one really relates to, I guess, the product coming from the wastewater effluent, and mainly related to the quantity or quality of that. And so did you run across any issues or challenges faced by the reuse providers due to any changes that were related to quality or quantity of the wastewater effluent?
In what has happened in several locations where there's been drought and or significant improvements in water use efficiency, over the years we've seen flows to the wastewater agencies get reduced, and so when the wastewater effluent is treated and sent onto the reclaim facility, often the water quality isn't what it was when the program started up. There's more concentrated remaining contaminants in it, and that just then increases the cost for the reuse provider to kind of get that more concentrated wastewater effluent stream up to the water quality standards it wants to meet as a reuse entity. So yeah, we do see those impacts from time to time.
Okay, so a few more questions coming in. One has to deal with this concept of full cost recovery, and does it happen in some situations more than others? So the question ultimately is, do you see full cost recovery more frequently in cases where there's an outside demand? For example, if there's a large agricultural or power production demand, and that's the big driver, as opposed to just using reclaimed water to meet some public water supply needs. So do you see that the full cost recovery happens more frequently when there's a big outside demand?
Not necessarily. In fact, some of what we found in working with the case study utilities is that, where they rely on, to a large extent, on one or a small number of large volume customers. Maybe there's a power plant that was kind of a really important anchor customer to start up the program, and they still are a really vital part of the demand structure. They're usually able at the outset of the program to leverage a very favorable price. And as the program matures and you have more demand, and you want to go back and renegotiate with that large power plant or any particular large customer, it can be a real challenge. So I think, I don't think having one or a small number of large customers necessarily helps. But here again, some of the lessons learned are, when you set up your program, you may have to offer really advantageous startup pricing for getting some of your large customers on board and to really make your program get started. But you can write into your contract the basis for cost escalations over time, and that can be really, really effective at helping you get towards full cost recovery. In some instances where there's been most success, they've used escalation clauses that link the reclaim price to escalations in the potable supply. So and with potable supply costs or pricing going up fairly rapidly in a lot of places, it's meant that they've been able to really start generating some meaningful revenue for their reuse program too.
Okay. So a few questions have came in related to utility size. I will try to combine several that I think are kind of getting at some of the similar or a similar question, and maybe it's two parts. And the first part is really, is this just an issue for big cities with high populations, or do you see this happening in smaller utilities with smaller populations? And I don't know what your thoughts are on that, as well as how that may impact pricing. Do you see, if it happens in smaller areas, does that have a bigger impact on price versus economies of scale in a larger utility?
Yeah. Well, I think reuse programs are, in general, migrated, may have started more in larger areas, where there is more concentration of population and commerce and more pressure on either the wastewater or the water supply systems. But I think it is moving more towards the, more medium-sized communities, as well as everybody begins to face, more and more constraints on their supply or how they manage their wastewater. So I think it's a direction where we'll see progress more broadly across communities of all sizes. So there will be economies of scale and maybe limited number of customers and so on that will create some additional challenges in the smaller communities.
Okay. So I guess in follow on to that to some degree, I guess more related to governance structure. So did you run into any examples of a situation where the same agency provide both the water and wastewater service, or if there was different ownership and how that may have impacted pricing? Did you see anything where if the same agency owned both the water and wastewater, when we're talking about working together, did that impact the price versus if you have these different ownerships of the different entities?
Yeah, that's a good question. We saw a little bit of that. We had one utility that was both a water and wastewater provider and had a reuse program. And the way they set it up, they were separate enterprise funds, and so there was a need to subsidize from one set of customers from one side of the shop to the other side of the shop. And I think the potable customers were paying some of the costs for the to compensate the wastewater side. But again, it was a municipal utility. And the wastewater and water supply customers are all one and the same. So, it was basically a wash as far as the customers were concerned. Although on the whole, they ended up with their cost savings associated with the reuse program really were just a net benefit, even though it didn't show up on the financial ledger. And also another example where the wastewater entity was half owned by the same municipality that was the water supplier, and there was some jockeying about how much they were going to charge the water supply agency, even though they were kind of jointly owned by the same city. So yeah, it can go either way.
Right. Okay. So we're approaching the end of our time here today. We'll have one final question to finish it off. And so this question really talks about, are you aware of any examples involving a reuse program ultimately with a single customer? And if so, how did that pricing compare, or any considerations of having a single customer versus ones with multiple or many customers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when it's if you're dealing with one customer, there are certainly some economies of scale and some simplicities, but there are also, you are at risk of, they can hold a lot of leverage over you. And if that customer keeps demanding, high subsidies, or maybe that one large customer changes the production process or goes out of business or relocates, you can really be stuck. So as with anything, the more diversified your portfolio, the better. That is, you may want to secure a real long-term contract where you can escalate costs and where there are some guarantees on your revenue stream going forward.
Okay. Well, thanks for answering all the questions, Bob. And that will conclude our webcast today. So I just want to first thank everyone for joining us, and remind you that there should be a few questions that pop up on your screen, and that helps us out if you are able to respond to those. And also a reminder that an electronic version of the webcast will be available on the website on the project page that we talked about at the beginning in the next few days. So thank you.